In 1589, inside a locked chamber of the Louvre, far from council halls and guard rotations, Henry III stood before a mirror and prepared to disappear. Contemporary accounts describe his hands as unusually slender, carefully manicured, moving with ritual precision. He adjusted a silk gown embroidered with gold thread, the kind imported from Italy and Venice. Fine French rice powder was applied to smooth the chest and neck, a cosmetic widely used at court but rarely acknowledged in official records. Pearls, symbols of purity and royal refinement, rested against his skin. A blonde wig, powdered and styled, concealed the unmistakable outline of the king. This was not theater for an audience. It happened behind locked doors, with only a handful of trusted servants present, many bound by silence and patronage. Outside those walls, France was tearing itself apart. Catholic and Protestant factions turned streets into battlefields. Assassination had become a political language. A king could be murdered in his own capital for appearing weak, indecisive, or morally suspect. Yet inside this chamber, another order existed. Movements were slow, deliberate. Nothing was accidental. According to later memoirs and hostile pamphlets, sources colored by bias but persistent in detail, these transformations followed a repeated pattern. This was not improvisation. It was routine. It was control. What matters historically is not the clothing itself. Cross-dressing alone was not unheard of in Renaissance courts, especially in masquerades. What sets Henry III apart is secrecy and consistency. These moments were not public spectacle. They were hidden, protected, and fiercely guarded. For a man whose life was spent under relentless scrutiny, this locked room functioned as a boundary between survival and collapse. The irony is impossible to ignore. Absolute power allowed him to command armies and execute rivals, but it did not allow him to exist openly in the body that brought him peace. If this was the only place he could breathe, the question becomes unavoidable. What kind of kingdom forces its king to live as a secret? Born in 1551 at the royal palace of Fontainebleau, Alexander Edouard de France entered the world already surrounded by expectation. He was the fourth son of Henry II and Catherine de' Medici, a dynasty obsessed with heirs, bloodlines, and visible strength. From the beginning, court observers noted that this child did not resemble the sons a kingdom at war believed it needed. While his brothers were pushed toward hunting, jousting, and early military discipline, Alexander showed little interest in any of it. Contemporary descriptions portray him as physically delicate, inward-looking, and unusually drawn to the women of the court. He spent long hours watching ladies-in-waiting dress, listening to conversations about poetry and courtly manners, fascinated by fabrics, perfumes, and ceremony rather than weapons. In a 16th-century royal household, this was not harmless eccentricity. Masculinity was not a personal trait. It was a political obligation. The tension surfaced publicly during a major religious festival when the young prince disappeared for several hours. The court panicked. A missing royal child meant vulnerability, scandal, even assassination. When he was finally found, he was not injured or frightened. According to later court anecdotes, he was discovered in the private chambers of one of his mother's ladies-in-waiting, dressed in her gown, calmly playing the role of a princess in an imagined story. When confronted, he did not deny it. He did not apologize. He reportedly said only that he wanted to know what it felt like to be beautiful. That response unsettled the court far more than the act itself. A child who lied could be corrected. A child who spoke plainly exposed something adults did not know how to name. The reaction was swift. Tutors were replaced. Discipline was tightened. His father, shaped by war and injury, viewed the incident as a failure of authority. Yet suppression did not erase the behavior. It taught the child something more dangerous: how to hide. This moment matters because it marks the beginning of a pattern, not rebellion, but concealment. When a prince refuses the script of masculinity, the court faces a choice: force him into it, or bury the deviation deep enough that it never threatens the crown. Which option preserves power better? After the incident that unsettled the court, Catherine de' Medici did what few mothers in 16th century Europe could afford to do. She reassessed. At first, she followed expectation. Tutors were replaced. Instruction grew stricter. Masculine discipline was reinforced through language lessons, religious study, and carefully supervised court appearances. The goal was correction, but Catherine was not only a mother. She was a regent in waiting, trained by Italian statecraft, and surrounded by enemies who noticed every crack in the royal image. Over time, her approach shifted. Not because the behavior disappeared, it did not, but because she recognized something more dangerous than difference: unpredictability. According to later memoirs and court gossip, Catherine quietly allowed her son limited access to the women's quarters under conditions of absolute discretion. Servants were chosen carefully. Doors were closed. Silence was enforced through loyalty, fear, and reward. What could not be erased was instead contained. This was not acceptance in any modern sense. It was management. In a court where rumors could topple alliances and pamphlets could ignite riots, Catherine understood that repression alone created risk. A secret discovered accidentally was far more explosive than a secret controlled from above. By supervising her son's private world, she reduced the chance that others would weaponize it first. Officially, the education of Alexander Edouard remained impeccable. He studied Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish. He learned rhetoric, diplomacy, and ceremony. Unofficially, his household also included tailors, perfumers, and etiquette specialists, figures easily justified as court necessities, yet essential to a quieter, parallel education. Everything had a public explanation. Everything had a private purpose. What emerges here is not a story of indulgence, but of strategy. Catherine did not ask whether her son's inclinations were right or wrong. She asked whether they could destabilize the crown. Her solution taught the boy a lesson that would shape the rest of his life. Some truths survive only if they are divided. This matters because it institutionalized duplicity. A child raised to live two lives does not unlearn the habit easily. If survival depends on secrecy, openness becomes a threat. And when concealment begins this early, the question lingers: was there ever a path back to a single self, or was the division already permanent? In 1569, at just 18 years old, Alexander Edouard was appointed supreme commander of the royal army by his brother, King Charles IX. The decision shocked the court and unsettled the ranks. The young duke's reputation preceded him: cultivated, reserved, rumored to be delicate. Soldiers who had survived years of religious warfare expected a leader shaped by brutality, not refinement. To many, his appointment looked like political theater, not military logic. The skepticism did not last long. On the blood-soaked fields of Jarnac and Moncontour, the results were unmistakable. Royal forces crushed the Protestant armies with strategies that emphasized timing, coordination, and restraint rather than reckless force. Contemporary military reports describe movements that were measured, formations held longer than expected, and decisions made without visible panic. Victory came not through spectacle, but through control. What unsettled observers was not that Alexander won. It was how he won. He did not perform masculinity the way commanders were expected to. He did not rage publicly. He did not posture. He watched. He waited. He adjusted. Traits long mocked in him: attention to detail, emotional restraint, sensitivity to atmosphere, became tactical advantages. Soldiers survived because their commander did not rush them into chaos. Yet even here, in the most traditionally masculine space imaginable, the division remained intact. Officers noted a strange habit that followed each major success. After battle, while others celebrated or tended to spoils, Alexander would withdraw completely. He disappeared into his private tent for hours. No witnesses, no explanations. When he returned, accounts mention a change difficult to articulate: a calmness, a faint floral scent, a composure that felt out of place amid mud and blood. No official record explains what happened inside that tent. We only know the pattern repeated: victory, withdrawal, return, silence. In an environment where vulnerability could be fatal, questions were not asked. Historically, this matters because it complicates the caricature. Henry III was neither an incompetent aesthete nor a failed warrior. He functioned effectively in war while remaining internally divided. The same discipline that allowed him to plan battles may have been what kept his private life compartmentalized and hidden. The irony is sharp. He proved himself where masculinity was supposed to matter most. And still, it was not enough. If he could command armies and win wars, why did he still need to vanish after each battle, alone, unseen, behind canvas walls? In 1573, Alexander Edward achieved what few European princes could without bloodshed. He was elected King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. The victory was not his alone. It was the result of a meticulously orchestrated diplomatic campaign led by Catherine de' Medici, built on negotiations, promises, and carefully distributed bribes. For France, it was a strategic triumph. For Alexander, it was something else entirely. Poland offered distance. Distance from Paris. Distance from familiar eyes trained to detect weakness. Distance from a court that had watched him since childhood and learned how to read his silences. In Krakow, his authority was new, his reputation unfinished. He used that freedom immediately. Contemporary accounts describe a court transformed almost overnight. Lavish clothing, imported perfumes, elaborate ceremonies that felt foreign to Polish nobles accustomed to austerity. Most notable was the group of young French companions he brought with him, later mockingly called the Mignons. Selected for loyalty, beauty, and refinement, they were not merely favorites in the political sense. According to diplomatic correspondence, especially reports sent back to Venice, these men formed an intimate inner circle. Behind closed doors, the king and his companions engaged in carefully staged rituals of transformation, costumes, makeup, rehearsed movements. These were not spontaneous indulgences. They followed structure. Roles were assigned. Silence was maintained. A Venetian ambassador wrote of gatherings he described with both fascination and alarm, noting that the king appeared dressed as a woman of astonishing beauty, accompanied by similarly transformed attendants. Such reports were hostile, morally charged, and written for political consumption, but their consistency across sources suggests something real was being observed, not imagined. What matters historically is intention. This was not hiding in isolation. It was construction. In Poland, Alexander did not merely escape judgment. He rebuilt his private world with precision and witnesses. He ruled by day, and by night inhabited a court within a court, one governed by aesthetics rather than law. For a moment, the separation held. The kingdom functioned. The secret endured. But dynasties do not pause for personal reinvention. When news arrived that his brother, King Charles IX of France, was dead, the refuge collapsed instantly. The crown of France was calling him back, and with it came the question he could no longer avoid. What happens to a carefully controlled secret when it is forced to return to the place that taught it to hide? In 1574, Alexander Edward returned to France not as a prince or commander, but as king. He was crowned Henry III, inheriting a realm already exhausted by religious war and political betrayal. From the outside, his reign appeared to promise refinement. The Louvre was reshaped into a center of culture, ceremony, and aesthetic order. Art, fashion, music, and ritual flourished under his patronage. But culture, in a fractured kingdom, is never neutral. Almost immediately, rumors followed him back across the border. What had been whispered in Poland now found a more hostile audience in Paris. Pamphlets began circulating in the streets. Cheap paper, crude woodcuts, exaggerated bodies. The king was depicted as effeminate, sinful, morally corrupted. His close companions, the Mignons, were painted as predators and parasites. The language was not subtle. Words like sodomite and monster were used not as accusations to be proven, but as weapons to be thrown. This was not random gossip. It was political strategy. In 16th century France, kingship was inseparable from masculinity. A ruler was expected to embody strength, fertility, and martial authority. Any suggestion of softness, ambiguity, or sexual irregularity undermined not just personal honor, but legitimacy itself. No army needed to march on Paris if the king's image could be dismantled first. Eyewitness accounts describe the persistence of Henry's private rituals even after his coronation. Long hours behind locked doors, elaborate preparation, gowns more extravagant than those worn by noble women, servants sometimes failing to recognize him in the dim corridors at dawn. These details, repeated by hostile sources, were exaggerated but not invented. The consistency of the accusations gave them power. What matters historically is that Henry did not deny the rumors publicly, nor could he fully escape them. Silence was interpreted as guilt. Defense would have required confession. Either option weakened him. His enemies understood this perfectly. They did not need proof. They needed repetition. The result was a slow erosion of authority. Respect bled away in pamphlets and caricatures long before it did on the battlefield. Henry still wore the crown. He still issued commands. But his image, once questioned, could not be restored. This is the quiet violence of reputation. No blood was spilled, yet damage accumulated daily. If kings are made as much by belief as by law, the question becomes unavoidable. When the image collapses, how long can power pretend it still stands? In 1575, King Henry III married Louise of Lorraine, a union that appeared, on the surface, conventional and politically sound. Louise was pious, discreet, and well-connected, qualities valued in a court already saturated with scandal. Public ceremonies emphasized harmony and continuity. Privately, expectations narrowed to one urgent task, producing an heir for the fading Valois dynasty. The heir never came. Year after year passed without pregnancy, without public explanation. In a royal marriage, infertility was not a private disappointment. It was a political crisis. The survival of a dynasty depended on visible reproduction. Whispers began immediately, but unlike the rumors surrounding the king's companions, this silence was heavier, more dangerous. Later correspondence and memoirs suggest that Louise was not ignorant of her husband's private life. According to documents uncovered centuries later, she did not confront it publicly, nor did she attempt to expose it. Instead, she adapted. She remained loyal, attentive, and outwardly devoted. Some accounts even suggest she assisted in maintaining discretion, managing schedules, protecting private spaces, and shielding the king from intrusive eyes. This was not a romantic partnership in the modern sense. It was a negotiated coexistence. Louise gained status, security, and influence. Henry gained something far rarer, complicity without scandal. In a court obsessed with appearances, her silence functioned as protection. Historically, the absence of an heir destabilized everything. Without succession, every rumor carried greater weight. Every accusation felt more final. Enemies of the crown no longer had to imagine the end of the Valois line. It was unfolding in real time, quietly, without blood. The irony is stark. The marriage that was meant to restore legitimacy instead highlighted fragility. Louise did not betray her husband. She stood beside him until the end. But dynasties do not survive on loyalty alone. When no child is born, someone must be blamed. And in a kingdom already primed for moral judgment, the question lingers. When a crown has no future, who does history decide is at fault? By 1589, France had narrowed its tolerance to almost nothing. Politically isolated, abandoned by Paris, and condemned by rival factions, Henry III ruled a kingdom that no longer wanted him. The Catholic League denounced him as immoral. Protestant forces mistrusted him. Pamphlets had already judged him long before any court ever could. His authority remained on paper, but belief, the true currency of kingship, had evaporated. On the morning of August 1st, 1589, at the royal camp in St. Cloud, a young Dominican friar named Jacques Clement requested a private audience. He claimed to carry urgent intelligence. Henry, exhausted and dangerously hopeful, agreed. There were no elaborate precautions, no public ceremony, just two men in a confined space. Clement drew a dagger and drove it into the king's abdomen. Henry did not die immediately. He suffered through the night, conscious, aware, his body failing slowly. According to contemporary accounts, he summoned Henry of Navarre, his successor, to his bedside. With his final strength, he urged loyalty and unity, framing his own death as a consequence of delayed judgment. At dawn on August 2nd, the last Valois king was dead. He was 37 years old. The assassination ended a dynasty, but it also sealed something else. The official narratives that followed focused on scandal, weakness, and moral failure. His private life was reduced to mockery. His companions were dismissed as degenerates. The locked rooms, the rituals, the divided existence, all of it was flattened into caricature. What disappeared was complexity. The fact that Henry had governed while divided, that he had survived by concealment, that he had created a parallel life not out of excess, but necessity. He was not killed for wearing gowns in secret. He was killed because the world around him no longer permitted ambiguity, silence, or difference, especially in a king. History chose an easy memory. Ridicule travels farther than nuance. But if the final dagger ended his reign, it was the long refusal to see him clearly that ended his life much earlier. And if all that remains is laughter and slander, the final question is unavoidable. How many truths about power, identity, and survival were locked away forever when that chamber door at the Louvre finally closed?